that this is some important information and we're all excited to hear about it. So thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you to the EPAS team who have agreed to help us better understand the program. And maybe I will have each of the speakers introduce themselves, and then we can just get started. So I have Karen, Dr. Karen Bax, first in my screen. So Karen, can you just give a little intro?
Sure, thanks, Michelle. Hi, everyone, welcome. My name is Karen, and I am a researcher at Western University and also a psychologist, and I'm very interested in interventions for children and families living with epilepsy, and that's one of the main studies that I'm working on right now. But I was also very excited to be part of this study as well, and this project, and look forward to sharing it with you today.
Great, thanks, Karen. Next, I have Dr. Elizabeth Kerr.
Hi there, I'm a clinical neuropsychologist at the Hospital for Sick Children. I work with the epilepsy surgery program and have done for a very long time. And I also head up the epilepsy classroom at Sick Kids. So a big part of my job is trying to find strategies for parents and teachers to support students at school.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. Dr. Mary Lou Smith.
Good morning, everyone. I am a researcher at the University of Toronto and a clinical neuropsychologist at the Hospital for Sick Children. I have been working in the epilepsy field for many decades, and this particular project has been a long time aspiration for me, and I'm very glad that it's come to pass. EPAS come to pass.
Great, thank you. Dr. Tamara Travaris.
Hi, thank you. So my name is Tamara, and I'm a postdoc fellow working at the Hospital for Sick Children, supervised by Mary Lou Smith, but also have collaborated with the other members on other projects. My research is actually focusing on how youth with epilepsy process different social and emotional information. And I was brought onto the study to help with the focus group that we'll talk about today, as well as analyzing the results of our study, which we'll also discuss today.
Very good, thank you very much. And last but not least, our very own Mary Sacco.
Hey, so I'm Mary Sacco. I've been affiliated with Epilepsy Southwestern Ontario for over 20 years. The first 13 as their executive director, and for the last 7 or so, I've been working on strategic initiatives, which is really a made-up title, but really what I was looking to do was to find some systemic ways to address some of the big problems that we have in epilepsy. So we've developed the Clinic to Community program to educate or to provide support for all individuals diagnosed with epilepsy, and EPAS for teachers. So this is a dream come true to be able to be given the time to work with such a high-powered group of individuals who have the experience and the knowledge to help us to develop this toolkit. So we're excited to be able to share it with everyone.
Great, thanks, Mary. So with that, I think I will pass it over to the EPAS team to get started. So Melissa, I'm not sure who you want to screen share.
Can I get host access so I can screen share?
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, there's a long list of names here. I have to find you.
Long list of names and great attendance, so thank you so much.
Okay, you should be good to go.
So am I echoing? Okay, so I'm the first speaker. So EPAS, Epilepsy and School Success, is a toolkit that was developed with funding from the Ontario Trillium Foundation and also with funding from Ontario Brain Institute as part of the epilepsy research programs. So because it was a research program and because we wanted to make sure the materials were all evidence-based, we began with something called a co-design workshop. But before I talk about what that is, I'd like to just give you a couple of important bullets. Number one, in 2018, there was a systemic review of 47 different studies looking at the knowledge and the attitudes of teachers worldwide. And in every one of the 47 studies, teachers had poor knowledge about epilepsy and reported low self-confidence in teaching children with epilepsy. So one would think, well, then there's obviously a need for EPAS. But when you Google epilepsy in school, you get over 39 million results. And if you Google epilepsy in teacher, you get 13 million results. So it's clear that there's a lot of information available, but somehow it's not changing the environment for our kids with epilepsy in the classroom. So we used a different approach to develop the EPAS materials. And what we used is something called a co-design workshop. So a co-design workshop is an opportunity to bring people together, frontline staff and program staff, to design with them rather than for them. And what you do in a co-design workshop is you capture suggestions, concerns, and opportunities that people who are known to the topic bring to your attention. So next slide, please. So what we did is we brought together a group of people to help us co-design the EPAS toolkit. But there are some really important rules in co-design. One, you got to remain neutral. You can't say, hey, I'm going to bring you together and show you my best materials. No, you have to remain neutral, and you cannot advocate for a predetermined outcome. So we knew when we brought these teachers together that we were going to listen to what they said and create a resource that they could use because it had components in it that mattered to them. So we brought together people who used resources. What we did is we invited 30 educators who had experience already working with children with epilepsy, and we chose 10 who agreed to become part of a 2-hour focus group. So the 10 included 4 special education teachers, 2 principals, 2 learning supervisors, 2 classroom teachers, one of whom was a parent with epilepsy as well. And we also had 4 school boards represented and both Catholic and public schools. We said, you're going to come to a 2-hour workshop. In the end, the goal is to identify the contents of a teacher toolkit. And we showed them prototypes from the United States, from Ontario, from Canada, from Australia. And we said, in the end, we would like to know the best way to talk about epilepsy to teachers, have them recognize different seizure types, seizure first aid, make them feel more comfortable about administering rescue medications and why they're important. We'd like them to know that epilepsy goes beyond the seizure event and includes the cognitive, psychological, and social consequences. We wanted to know how interactive should this unit be, and could you tell us what length you want and what format? Next slide, please. So what we did is we used a Likert scale, and it went from not at all effective to extremely effective. We had 18 different video clips, and we asked each teacher to watch in our group, watch the video clip and tell us how you would rank that. So if you just had that alone, how would you rank it? And then write any individual comments you have. So a comment could be, the slides are boring, nothing to maintain my focus or interest in my audience, or whatever. But we also then broke into group discussions on some salient topics. Here's what we learned, and here's what's really important to hear. Number one, when asked, how do you want to learn about epilepsy? They said, we like the way you do it already. We'd like you coming into our school with your staff and talking to us, because then we can make it very specific to the questions we need answered. But we knew that wasn't the goal of this unit, because if Epilepsy Southwestern Ontario was well serviced with staff, there were parts of the province and the country that aren't. So we knew we had to go beyond the individual interface, but that, I just want to reinforce, that was their number one choice, was to have a person come in and talk to them about epilepsy. Number two, small video, just 10 minutes. And in fact, they said 7 minutes, and our jaws dropped. And they said 10 minutes. You know what? This is one of many dozens and dozens of topics that we have to address. And if we don't have a child with epilepsy in our classroom, it's not top of the mind for us anyway. So for mandatory training, 10 minutes is what we would ask. But if there is a child with epilepsy in our class, we would like to know that there are a group of very good supplementary materials that we can access as needed. When we said interactive, do you want it interactive? They said not very. Little interest in tests, little interest in matching activities. And we talked about other curriculums, diabetes, EpiPen training, and any other mandatory curriculum. And they said, you know, unless you change that curriculum yearly, Teachers just go right to the end, they bypass the instructions, and they go straight to the test to get their certificate. So it wasn't really that encouraging, but we knew then we had a tall order to get something engaging for these teachers. And we heard conversations, and remember, we had cream of the crop in there. That's not saying that they would do this, but they said, you know, we're often in a staff meeting and a teacher's on their cell phone. So you need to make this engaging. You need to get the most information possible out in the quickest way possible. Next slide, please. So what we did is we showed them 18 different formats, and the format that seemed to resonate that we could expand upon came from the slides from the Clinic to Community program. So what they liked about these slides is that they liked the video. They felt it was very complementary to other materials they had, including a Mind Up program where they learn about the brain and how it works. Next slide, please. Teachers like the simplicity of this. They said these images would appeal to a visual learner. The labeling is excellent because it focuses in on what they need to learn. And the auditory, having the voiceover in these slides was really important because it appealed to auditory learners. They felt that the slides were good at telling a story about epilepsy without using heavy medical jargon. Next slide, please. And in fact, the comment that came out strongly was, it is not our job to be tested on the different definitions of seizures. We need to know what they look like and how to care for our students with epilepsy. Next slide, please. So the best conversation revolved around the use of live seizures in the 10-minute video. So anybody that's seen this before, this is a grainy, very old Epilepsy Foundation video of a little girl having a seizure on a couch. And we've used it in our interactions with teachers forever. And typically, you know, you show it and one teacher or two teachers will cry because it's quite hard to watch this little girl having a seizure. And it elicited great conversation, and I'll share that with you. After seeing the child with epilepsy have a seizure, one teacher suggested that we give a warning sign, that it is hard to watch and emotional. And another responded, it's not X-rated. Another told a story about her friend having a seizure in a movie theater as an adult, and that seizure first aid is a skill that everyone needs to know. One teacher felt it should be included in the basic unit, not included in the basic unit, just in the advanced. And to which another said, well, what happens if it's a child that has a first seizure? What happens if you're on yard duty? We have Rotary teachers. You can't just give it to the teacher who has a child with epilepsy in their class. And the teacher, who was a parent, came out and said, you know what? My daughter had a seizure in class, and the teachers were scared, and the kids were scared, and no one was prepared. They called in 3 EAs from the building to help. I want all of our teachers to know how to help her. So it ended with this, I think, great summary quote. It may induce panic, but in the same way we have fire alarms at school, and some kids are scared, but if we had a real fire, they would know what to do. Next slide, please. So this is kind of the way we evaluated the unit. This came out as extremely affected by, I think, 10 out of 10 of the teachers. So it stayed in the unit, even though it was grainy. What they liked is it showed true examples of what a tonic-clonic seizure looked like. It showed how calm the adult was beside the student, and the dialogue helped to reassure and educate. One teacher commented, I loved the voiceover. It said the child may lose bladder or bowel control or vomit after the seizure ends. She said that made me feel more prepared. Next slide, please. And we had other ones in there that they didn't think were effective. So it became pretty easy in a co-design workshop to say, well, we won't put that in, but we will put that in. So this one didn't seem as realistic because you weren't seeing the whole body. You didn't see the whole seizure. It might be scary, but cutting in too tight doesn't demonstrate the real thing. Next slide, please. When it came to seizure first aid, we all know there's tons of materials in the marketplace for that. And so we showed, I think, 4 to 5 different materials. And the 2 that got the highest ranking are the CEA Child on the Playground, which is the top right, and the Clinic to Community bottom left. So let me tell you what they liked about the CEA Playground video. They liked the fact, and they ranked it between extremely effective and effective. They said it shows a seizure can happen anywhere. It shows, but they wondered why we showed what not to do. They think teaching videos should only be what to do. They said it was dated but excellent. It was concise. The strategies were clear. They liked the use of children, showing that the seizure first aid is a skill. but they wondered where the adult was in the video. Okay. In the epilepsy, the clinician community wanted the bottom, the do not restrain the person. Again, ranked it the same way. They felt it was effective to extremely effective. Liked the organization of the steps, thought it was clear, concise, but too long. Couldn't sustain your attention having just slides go through 5 steps. And said, really liked having real people. Could we do something with real people? Next slide, please. So when you do co-design, you have to be open to listening to the advice of the people you're working with. And so we created a hybrid. So we developed a hybrid. We used the animation that was consistent. We listed the steps, which you can see written on the slide, but we filmed a student having a seizure in the classroom, and we taped the response of the teacher. Next slide, please. We also continued it to administer rescue medication, because this is often met with great resistance by teachers. So at the beginning of this seizure, the children jump up and they're surprised. And by the end, the teacher has them sitting back at the desks and she's administering first aid. We show the teacher calmly timing. We show the kids sitting in their desks. We show the teacher administering the medication through the cheek. And we explain in writing, which teachers like, that the pill is used to stop the neurons from misfiring. So it continued that story about a seizure is when the neurons misfire, and that this pill is used when they don't stop. Next slide, please. So we shared data. So knowing we had to go beyond seizure first aid and really get to the root of the challenges for our kids with epilepsy, we showed a lot around labeling of the brain. And this was all possible because of the amazing psychologists on the team who are experts in the brain and how it functions. So we shared this fact with the teachers. 50% of Canadian adults with epilepsy are unemployed. And we used this stat to reinforce that their role as teachers was more than the management of this seizure event. They needed to develop learners who could participate after they've graduated from school in the global economy, in the Canadian economy. So what's unique about this unit is that it was developed by experts. The first experts were the teachers who used the toolkit, and the second experts are the clinical psychologists who put into the unit how the brain works and what strategies we can use to support the cognitive, psychological, and social consequences. Next slide, please. So for the final 30 minutes of our co-design workshop, we broke into small groups. So Karen, Mary Lou, and Elizabeth, the 3 clinical psychologists on the team, each sat with a group of these teachers and looked at other materials from around the world that would address what happens below the surface. So we had already talked about the tip of the iceberg. Now we wanted to drill down into creating a resource that helped teachers to support the child with epilepsy in their cognitive, psychological, and social impacts. Thank you.
Okay, so now I will briefly review our study, which evaluated whether the video Mary discussed can improve knowledge about epilepsy. And given the importance of teachers' knowledge about epilepsy on children's school performance, their social skills, and safety, we were interested in evaluating whether this brief, cost-effective video can improve teachers' knowledge about epilepsy. So the study I'll highlight was published earlier this year in Epilepsy and Behavior, and the video and the toolkit and the publication can be found in the following link, and I've also included the link in the chat box as well. So in our study, participants included pre-service teachers enrolled at the Faculty of Education at Western University in London, and students attending a class for a mandatory course were invited to participate in the study. They completed the pre-training questionnaire, then they watched the 10-minute training video, and 2 weeks later, the participants completed the questionnaire again. So the pre and post questionnaire included questions evaluating general knowledge about epilepsy, such as the definition, or can seizures manifest as a blank stare. We also included questions assessing knowledge about seizure safety, including when should an ambulance be called, when is a seizure a medical emergency, and questions assessing knowledge about the common comorbidities associated with epilepsy. So a bit about our participants. So we had 57 pre-service teachers who completed the pre and post training questionnaires. The mean age of our participants was 28 years of age, and their ages ranged from 24 to 48, and nearly 70% of our sample were female. The majority of the participants were enrolled in the intermediate senior division, and the majority were specializing in STEM education. So this is a graphical representation of our results. So here the y-axis represents the accuracy scores in the pre and post questionnaires, and the x-axis represents the different categories. Green bars represent accuracy scores pre-training, and blue bars represent accuracy scores post-training. And the accuracy scores significantly increased for each category and for the total questionnaire scores after watching the video. So this was 2 weeks after watching the video. So overall, we found that watching the brief video enhanced epilepsy knowledge amongst pre-service teachers.
Hi, so we have 4 supplementary books addressing general information, some of which is covered in the video, as well as the cognitive, psychological, and social consequences of the condition. And, just through clinical practice, we know that among teachers, there's often a lack of understanding that epilepsy is a disease of the brain and therefore can have the cognitive, psychological, and social consequences. Each booklet contains an overview of the topic and then also includes strategies to support the various issues raised. And the focus group were extremely excited about the strategies, emphasizing that they needed them to care for students with epilepsy in the classroom. We really tried to get at if we had too much or we had too little. They didn't want us to remove anything. They wanted them all. They globbed onto it. Next. Based on epidemiological studies worldwide, we know that cognitive issues present in the majority of children living with epilepsy. Unfortunately, the difficulties often go unrecognized at school, and consequently, they're not supported. We also know that cognitive issues often present early in the course of epilepsy, and for some individuals actually predate the onset of seizures. And while there's lots of different types of learning profiles, the most frequent presenting issues are problems with attention, processing, speed, memory, and intellectual functioning. And I'm going to cover some examples of what we did for those now, but we also have some pages on executive functioning, language, and motor functioning. Next. So sustained attention, or the ability to remain focused for extended periods of time, particularly if something's boring or mundane, like listening to a teacher talk, is the most common type of attention issue experienced by children living with epilepsy. And that's likely because attention networks are widely distributed throughout the brain. In fact, ADHD is significantly more common in children with epilepsy than in the general population. It occurs approximately in 30 to 40% of children living with epilepsy. And unlike classical ADHD, the inattentive subtype is the most common, and boys and girls are equally affected. Looking at strategies, we know that educational and behavioral supports can be effective. And in our toolbox, we have about a page worth of strategies, including the ones that you see here. Next. So slow or inconsistent processing of information is common and can result in variable responding, difficulty working quickly and methodically, difficulties learning a routine and keeping pace with lessons, which in turn can lead to gaps in learning and frustration. And these issues are seen in about 42% of children living with epilepsy. And again, we provide numerous strategies for supporting any child with slow processing speed in the classroom. And there are a few examples listed below, including avoiding competitions, because that puts a lot of undue stress on a child. Next. Memory issues are very common. About 70% of children report issues in their daily lives with memory. And on formal assessment, 50% of children with active epilepsy display weaknesses. As you will all know, memory is a very complex operation, which can be affected by other cognitive processes, including attention, effort, self-monitoring, speed of processing, the use of strategies, and organization. Additionally, for memory to work properly, the brain needs to continually monitor itself, and seizures can interfere with that brain self-monitoring process. The most common issues that we see for children living with epilepsy are forgetting what they've just heard or what they've just read, forgetting remote events, even very special trips that they went on, trouble retrieving the words or information in the moment that they need in order to participate in class discussions, and then abnormal rapid forgetting of information that they previously learned. So again, we provide numerous strategies for teachers to support a student with memory issues in the classroom, and just due to space, I've only given 2 examples. Next. In the general population, intellectual abilities occur in about 2%. For children living with epilepsy, the normal distribution of expected scores is shifted downwards. And so we see that about 25% of children with epilepsy in general will meet criteria for an intellectual disability. And the rate actually increases to 40% among those with active epilepsy. Additionally, we see fewer individuals with above intellectual functioning and fewer people with average intellectual functioning because the whole distribution is shifted downwards. Sometimes school offer particular programs for students who meet criteria for an intellectual disability, but there's also some general strategies to support these students, which are included in the toolkit. And I'll pass it over to Mary Lou. Oh, it's Karen, sorry.
No worries, thank you. I'll now share with you some information in the 3rd booklet prepared for educators on the psychological consequences of epilepsy. Like many medical issues, there are psychological consequences to epilepsy. That is, there are effects on both the mental and emotional states of children, resulting in change in behavior. In a study in Ontario, out of 144 parents, 111 or 77% expressed concern for their child's behavior. The most common behaviors that are of concern are externalizing behaviors that can be seen as irritability, agitation, angry outbursts or meltdowns, and negativity. These behaviors can be linked to anxiety or depression. We often see those behaviors in children who suffer from anxiety or depression, but they can also be primary to how the brain is affected by epilepsy. Next slide, please. Here we provide for educators some information about the most common psychological consequences of epilepsy for children. And research indicates that these disorders occur in approximately 1/3 of children living with epilepsy, which is a higher incidence than the general population of children. There are 2 primary reasons why children may suffer from anxiety and depression living with epilepsy. One is related to more of the structural abnormalities in the brain, related to mood and emotion regulations that could be affected. And the other is ongoing seizures that may disrupt the areas in the brain that control mood and emotion regulation. Secondary reasons why children have higher incidence of anxiety and depression living with epilepsy. The obvious worrying and anxiousness about having another seizure, worrying about how to talk to others about their seizures, what to say and how much to say. And some youth living with epilepsy just experience really intense emotional distress related to just not knowing when their next seizure might occur, or loss of control of their bodies during a seizure. Next slide, please. Here we provide some strategies to support positive behavior and well-being for the educators. And I'll just mention a few here. So creating a predictable schedule in a disease that is can be very unpredictable, having some control and understanding what the school day looks like, whether that be written or a visual schedule, can be very helpful. Talking about labeling emotions and teaching social emotional and self-regulation skills can be very important. Excuse me. Teaching a mindful moment or a mind break can be helpful. It can help create that gap between a child reacting and reacting when you want them to respond. So taking that mind break. Coming up with a plan with the child and or their parents on who they should tell at the school about their epilepsy, what they want to say, and the best way to do that can provide some relief for a child who's anxious about who knows or does not know. Providing time away from the desk, that is not about a consequence. It's about giving a place for a child to maybe have a space for self-regulation or to choose to do something different when they're feeling overwhelmed or very anxious. And practicing time in is really a strategy where another person, usually the adult or the educator, in the classroom provides that emotional support for a child for a few minutes by actually being with them in some way, talking with them, being close to them, etc. Use of social mapping can be helpful, again, for understanding what's expected in a classroom socially, and using many different ways to de-escalate problems by using distraction, humor, a break, out of the classroom, etc. Next slide, please. Finally, we know that a child's self-esteem can be affected by epilepsy. So there are many ways that can be used with the whole classroom actually to support self-esteem. But set the student up for success by helping them know and build, all the things that they're competent at and that they can do. So they're very aware of that. Providing leadership roles in the classroom for a child. Offering choices, rewards, topics, regarding topics, schoolwork, or even their homework. Being that partner and helping to having the child be a partner and helping them to decide what they can do and what is working for them. Obviously be encouraging, positive feedback, praise effort, praise persistence. Model and teach optimism. In our M3 program, we teach about the power of yet, and we have this little Yeti doll. And it's really, and what we do is we have the kids all say something they can't do. So I can't ride a bike, I can't draw people very well, I can't do math well. And then they go around and say, I can't ride a bike yet, and I can't, read yet. And it really gives a bit of a power that, an optimism around learning how to do something. Using growth mindset, we all make mistakes. Mistakes make our brains grow. I love that saying. So looking at and teaching that mistakes are okay and what can we learn from that, and teach and model gratitude and kindness. Next slide.
Okay, our fourth booklet is on the social consequences of epilepsy. And I'll just start by going back to the study that Karen mentioned of 144 parents. This was a study led by Mary Secco through her Community to Clinic project, Clinic to Community project. And of the parents they surveyed, 69% felt that their child was not doing well socially. And 57% of the parents were worried that their child would be teased or bullied at school. So huge problems. Next, please. And indeed, parents and children have expressed that the social aspects of their child's development is very, very important to them. Now, the literature shows that children with epilepsy, when they're compared with healthy controls, when they're compared with their siblings, when they're compared with kids with other chronic illnesses, tend to be less popular, less socially accepted. They have lower social competence, and as a result, have a number of social problems. They have more difficulties getting along with their peers, or their peers have more difficulties getting along with them, and they feel more socially isolated. And a serious issue is that many of these problems persist into adulthood and influence the individual's success in education, in the vocational realm, and in terms of the relationships that they can establish. Next, please. Okay, so I'm going to just tell you some results that we had from a qualitative study that my colleagues and I did, where we wanted to hear the voices of children with epilepsy and the impact of epilepsy on them. And in the social realm, we got some quite significant indicators. So this is a teenage girl who said, "I've thought that I don't really belong. I feel like I should have never been born. Sometimes I've thought that I could just be invisible and nobody would really care, or I could not be here and nobody would notice, and I just basically felt like a nobody." So this is a teenager describing how she just doesn't feel part of a group. She doesn't feel accepted. And as a result, she's standing back and outside of the social realm around her. This is a boy who was 12 who said, "Well, sometimes people just think I'm weird because I have epilepsy." And finally, oh, not finally, but second last, "They think I'm really different, how I have my seizures." So this brings the stigma of having seizures in public and what that does to kids. And this young girl said, "All the time, the kids at school never play with me." So she's being set up for being excluded and alone. Next. So we know, and you probably know through your work with families, that often children with epilepsy are impacted by adult overprotection and necessary and unnecessary restrictions at home and school. And why does this happen? It happens because adults themselves have to cope with the unpredictable natures of seizures in their children or in their students. They fear for the safety of the children, whether that is a reasonable fear or not. And they have anxiety. So there's a literature that suggests that parents of children with epilepsy have higher rates of anxiety than parents in the general population. And there are some very significant consequences of this type of overprotection. So first of all, children may become over-reliant on adults. Adults are always hovering around them, protecting them, saying, "Don't do this, I'll watch you when you do this," and so on. They may have fewer opportunities for socialization because their activities are restricted. And as a result, they may have fewer learning opportunities in their real world that teaches them how to get along and adapt. They may develop a sense of helplessness, like, why do I need these parents around me all the time? I guess it's because I can't do it on my own. This overprotection will suggest to kids that the world is a dangerous place for them. And finally, they may end up feeling that they cannot do things on their own. Next slide. I'm going to show you some quotes, again, from a qualitative study. This is of children who underwent epilepsy surgery, and they're commenting after surgery on the changes that they've noticed in their lives. And here are some quotes on the positive impact of the loosening of these restrictions. So this kid said, "I'm able to stay home by myself. Oh yes, big time change. I love staying at home by myself. It's so fun. I like going shopping in the mall by myself. Oh yeah, I can do that too." So he was so excited that he could do things on his own and that he could be alone and without the parents hovering. Next. "Before, I couldn't go anywhere without my mom or dad going because they were afraid I was going to have a seizure or something. And now, hopefully, when I'm 16, I can drive a car." So looking ahead to that rite of passage of getting the driver's license. But the comment of being without the parents and how liberating that is. And here's another kid commenting on the license. "It feels good just to be able to hear you can go for your license. You can live by yourself. You can have showers by yourself. You can have an independent life. All right, I'll take it." So what I was struck by is that this sense of this elation that they have when these restrictions and the hovering of adults have been released. Next, please. Okay, so again, in our booklet, we review some of the literature on social impact and social consequences of epilepsy, and we provide some strategies, including these that we see here. The first that we want to emphasize is that you can educate teachers and students to reduce stigma, and this is what the community epilepsy associations do very well. So we're encouraging schools, teachers to engage with you, to come into the school when that is possible. It's important to model and teach appropriate social behavior. When children's behaviors are socially inappropriate, it's important to teach them alternate behaviors to attain the same social goal. Some kids don't respect or don't have a sense of what is an appropriate personal space, and other kids don't like it when they're in their face all the time. And so teaching them a little bit about what's appropriate distancing. The social behavior mapping approach is important because it teaches kids what to do in typical situations, but it also provides them with strategies that they can use when something unexpected happens. We want parents and teachers to encourage involvement of kids in extracurricular activities, and these kids should not be excluded from school activities unless it's really medically necessary. So just the teacher feeling nervous that the kid's going to go on the bus to the museum, that's not enough reason to exclude them. And next, please. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Tamara.
Okay, great. So in terms of our knowledge translation plan, we are in the process of promoting and distributing the toolkit and the website link. Specifically, we have been targeting educators through the Ontario school boards, teachers' colleges, private and independent schools. We have also been targeting healthcare practitioners who would be involved in providing recommendations to families and teachers. So the toolkit has been sent to the Canadian Psychological Association, CLAE, Eplink, as well as our personal networks. So to finish off, we'd like to thank the sponsors and the following agencies, as well as the participants who participated in the focus group and the study. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to all of you for sharing this information. I think it's really valuable for, excuse me, community organizations who are providing support to teachers and to families living with epilepsy. I also just want to take 1 second to acknowledge my colleague Melissa, who was sort of the behind the scenes person creating the or putting together the content and making it look nice for EPAS. So thank you so much, Melissa. We have about 15 minutes, so I wondered if anyone has any questions. And I'm just looking how I see all of you so I know who's asking questions. Actually, I wondered about, Mary Lou, you were referencing a study that you did with the quotes that were coming through that from some of the kids. And I wondered what the reference is for that, because some of those are really powerful. And I think even just from a grant writing perspective, having access to those would be fabulous. I wonder if you could share that.
Sure, that's a paper that we published in Epilepsy and Behavior. And if you just give me a minute while other people are chatting and discussing, I'll put the reference in the chat box. And if anybody misses it from the chat box and they want to get in touch with me, they're very welcome to do so, and I'll send them a copy.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you. And I think even just having this publication from EPAS will allow us to bring some credibility to grant writing and being able to say there's an evidence-based program. So we really appreciate all of this. I see that Holly has her hand raised. Holly, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just curious if in the future you might be making activities for students to teach them about epilepsy, not instead of the presentation, but in addition to, possibly. Like throughout the year, instead of having epilepsy educators come in, there might be an opportunity for teachers to teach activities about epilepsy.
I'll answer that one. Is there a general need? Does the group feel that that would be value added to the EPAS program? Show of hands. So those things are very, very possible, and I'll make a note of that. What we decided to do was have a website called epilepsyforeducators.ca. So all of these materials will be uploaded to that, including the webinar today. And all of the EPAS materials, whether it's the 10-minute video or the 4 booklets, are currently available in both English and the French language. So we'll also upload onto that website any articles or publications that talk about this. but we'll have a comment section. I know Melissa's been wonderful. She's going to have an info. So if teachers had questions or wanted more, they could go to send that to us and we would field those questions. In addition, years ago, we did something called Brain Matters, which was a really nice curriculum unit for grade 12 teachers. So it's a biology unit. And we're going to take portions of that and upload that to this same portal. So if you're a teacher and you look and you're a high school teacher, you can grab parts of that. The only reality of that unit is that some of the language is no longer correct. So we don't want to confuse teachers by calling something by an old name and having them think, okay, this is what's confusing about epilepsy. What is petit mal, or what is a complex partial seizure if you don't use those names anymore? So we'll be uploading that as well. So we're going to try to create quite a nice portal. If there's a need for materials for children in the classroom, we can add that as well. It's a good question.
Great.
Can I just add to the, or sorry, can I just add to that, that if you go to the Hospital for Sick Children's website on About Kids Health, they do have a video that explains epilepsy in child-friendly terms. It can be used for other kids.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you. Cynthia?
Hi, I believe it was when Karen was speaking about depression and anxiety. I just have a question. It indicates that it's due to the epilepsy. I understand that. Is it more complex than that, or can it be? Because I do know cases where the person has a surgery or they're seizure free through the meds, but they still have the depression and anxiety. It carries forward. And just wondering how, like it's broader than just being as a result of seizures or worrying about having a seizure, because this worry has gone, but the anxiety and some depression has remained.
I can start to address that and others can jump in if they want. So there's been a lot of research on anxiety and epilepsy in depression, and now it's recognized that there's a bi-directional relationship. So people with anxiety and depression are actually at greater risk for getting epilepsy than people in the general population, and the reverse as well is true as well. People with epilepsy are at higher risk of anxiety and depression. And people now believe that there are common underlying mechanisms, brain mechanisms, whether it's at the neurotransmitter level or the actual structural level. So when individuals have surgery, it stops the seizures, but the underlying neural brain substrates obviously are still abnormal, and that can help explain why people continue to have anxiety and depression. The second thing is that you're probably aware that there's a literature on adaptation after epilepsy surgery. And although many people think that if they stop having seizures, they'll be able to get on with life, it actually is quite a complex adaptation, and it may take years in order for individuals to change the role that they had and the feelings that they had. And this can also play into the continuing anxiety and depression. I don't know if any of my colleagues want to jump in and add anything else.
No. Okay. I can see Jeff waving his hand.
It's old school, eh, Michelle? I know there's a button in here to wave my hand, but maybe more toward Mary. A couple of questions. First is, I remember when we did the grade 5 program, one of the things I always felt a little uncomfortable with, but you always felt was really important, was when somebody had a seizure on the spot and then the kids reacted. Was that floated past your focus group? How did they react to that?
They did. They reacted to that child on the couch having a seizure, and it was the most dynamic conversation. So we're going to write a publication on that, because we recorded that whole focus group, because it was very interesting. Some saying X-rated, some saying get over yourself. I'm sorry it hurts your feelings, but this is a life skill. So they did comment on it. And what they liked about it is the preparedness, that you don't know when it's going to happen.
Mary, it was more the simulated one that we used to do. Someone would have a seizure and the students would kind of react, and then they'd have to see, it happened at the end of the workshop to see if they really knew what to do. I wondered if that whole concept was floated past the teachers.
No, it wasn't floated past the teachers in this case.
And my other question is, it's really interesting that the number one thing that you talked about was the value of going into the schools in person, and here we are in a COVID environment, and all that went by the wayside for the past year and a half or two. We don't know what it's going to be like moving forward, with how receptive the schools will be to have. I wonder if there will be some maybe recommendations about how to keep the dynamism of this program, but maybe in some kind of a hybrid method.
It's a really good question. So we might be using, and the educators on the line are the best to talk about that. So I noticed Sandra's on the line from Epilepsy Southwest Ontario, but we might be able to use the 10-minute video for a really good overview of epilepsy and the impact on the brain, followed by a Q&A with your community epilepsy educator. And oftentimes when we're invited in, it's because of a specific student, and that hasn't been negated by the program. That's still the opportunity for the staff person from a community epilepsy agency to bring in extra strategies, to point out where these would be relevant, to ask the teacher to speak to the parent about the challenges that child might face both at home and at school, so that they're building kind of a plan of care around that child.
Thank you.
But Sandra, do you have anything to add to that, or anyone that uses the face-to-face plus the program?
No, actually, that's a really good description, Mary. But yeah, it's the ability for them to kind of say, okay, I have questions, or here's the information now, but I have questions going forward. Who can I contact? And so it's that connection with the organization, which I think they appreciate. We've been still doing involvements with the schools, we're just doing it virtually. And it's, I think they're still getting a lot out of them, but I am looking forward to this video or the ePass as kind of a brief overview. I think this is going to be a really good addition to that for the teachers, because they still do really need this.
So I think Jeff's point is really important. And when we developed ePass, we never intended it to replace what you do, like going into the schools, but we recognized that there were times and places where it wasn't possible. So we looked at it more as a supplement. And then again, COVID came to be and it emphasized that even more.
Can I point out something? Thank you, Mary Lou and Jeff. Can I point out something else that was interesting about the focus group to me as an educator for schools for so many years? They are so afraid of administering rescue medication, right? And we get that all the time in our conversations. And I said, well, why are you not afraid of putting an injection into the thigh of a child? And the comment came, oh, we've been doing EpiPen training for years. I said, so you're now comfortable? And they said, yeah, we're comfortable. So for years, they've been watching the same video or having the house unit come in, getting the same accreditation. And now they just think of that as a normal part of anaphylaxis. So I hope that in the future, they'll start to watch these over and over and over and see the administration of rescue medications for kids with epilepsy as being as easy to do and as just as common. So we also showed them a video. We have a Q&A with Dr. Andrea Andrade, and she gives, I think, tremendous information on rescue medication, but they didn't like that as much. They said it was great for supplementary, but way too overwhelming for them. So on our website, there's also a question and answer with a community neurologist on why you should administer rescue medication. But they felt just that little video we did where we're showing, and if it doesn't stop within 5 minutes, you simply do this, that just making that part of the normal conversation would reduce this panic that they felt. So it's really interesting when you co-design something, you make something that you didn't expect to make at the beginning. And I think that's important for all of our materials, whatever we give to people. If you're going to give parents materials, make sure they work. Make sure they don't dispel myths. They dispel myths and not create them. And this has happened in the literature. There have been communities that now put something in the mouth of someone having a seizure because it was on an infographic. It showed this, but that community didn't know this and thinks that part of seizure first aid is to put something in the mouth. So we need to be accountable when we create materials so that we're always giving the best materials, and we all should know that they work. And I think that's why there's 39 million different things on the internet, because people don't know how to tease that out. They don't know what's good and what's not good. So we hope you feel today that we're giving you materials that are best practice, that are informed by the people who will use them and that work, and that you're welcome to use them everywhere. So Michelle will share that as well. Okay.
Yeah, for sure. And just to acknowledge my colleague, Nikki from Epilepsy Ottawa, who's been helping to do making connections with French-speaking neurologists to be able to translate these materials into French. So they'll be available for use sort of anywhere. And I'm not sure who's on the line from other provinces or even, oh, there we go. There is a portal in Ontario for teachers that is by the Ministry of Education. And so we're hopeful that this type of material gets onto that so that we know that teachers are as Mary referenced, seeing best practices and evidence-based programs. So we're again grateful to the EPAS team, and I'm grateful to Nikki and her colleagues for helping us with the French translation as well. Yeah. We have about 3 minutes left. Any last burning questions?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
I'm wondering, I never heard of medication, an urgency medication in Quebec, never. So is it just in all the Canada except Quebec? Or I don't know.
Wow. So you mean that they're not using the rescue medications there?
Never heard of that, never. And I have a son who's having epilepsy, so.
Okay. Well, I'm not quite sure how to answer that, except to say that typically if seizures don't end naturally on their own, they would intervene with a rescue medication. So I'm not quite sure. Anyone else have any insight?
So Elaine, you're welcome to go to Epilepsy for Educators, and I can't confirm right now .ca, but there's a video with Dr. Andrea Andrade who's speaking about when a seizure goes more than 5 minutes. Oftentimes you put and this is more Elizabeth, I prefer you describe this than me, but oftentimes you put a medication into the buccal part of the cheek and it dissolves, and it's an Ativan, or and it stops the neurons from misfiring. And this happens to children who have seizures that are longer than 5 minutes, typically that are convulsive seizures. If you don't do that and the child continues to have seizures, it can cause the muscles in the chest and in the neck to swell and to eventually close, which can cause a medical emergency. And so those children would end up at risk in emergency departments. So in Ontario, the law now is that if a child needs a rescue medication for epilepsy, that the school must have an individualized plan of care for that child, including how to administer that medication at the school after a 5-minute seizure. So I'm not I leave my comfort zone when we talk about this, but do any of the clinical psychologists want to comment on the use of rescue medications?
Just probably a bit of a window. It's about 3 to 5 minutes. It's prescribed by the neurologist. And the other piece is that we know that prolonged seizures are damaging to the developing brain. And so they also want to prevent this seizure early. From a school point of view, they really want to reduce the number of 911 calls that they make. As soon as a child has a seizure, even if they're not known to have a prolonged seizure, they're calling 911. So there's something that they can do and not panic in the moment.
Well, I knew all of that, but I'm telling you, in Quebec, we have no such thing as emergency medication.
Wow.
No such
So
thing.
I'm
sad for my child.
We might be calling it something different because sometimes it's nasal, sometimes it's rectal. The one that we ask the teachers is in the mouth. In Ontario, we've had tragedies around anaphylaxis. So we had Sabrina's Law. In Ontario, we had tragedy around a child having an asthma attack and not having access to their Ventolin, and they died. So we have been working hard as an Ontario group, and huge kudos to Epilepsy Ontario for leading this, to get the Ministry of Education for the province of Ontario to make it mandatory that our kids are protected in the classroom as well. So this is a Conversation Ontario. It's also in Saskatchewan, I believe, because they've asked us for materials for Saskatchewan as well. That's mandatory, that teachers have a plan of care and a protocol for a child with an emergency need, including epilepsy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Mary. I did notice that Melissa put the Dr. Andrade video in the chat, and that Mary Lou also put the study that I was asking about in the chat. So if you're interested in that, maybe take a note of that. So with that, I just want to thank all of you for coming. And I really, really want to thank the EPAS team. You guys did a fantastic job, and you've empowered us with evidence-based materials, and it helps us to do our jobs better when we're providing support around a child with epilepsy, and also even just from the grant writing perspective. So thank you so much. And thank you all for coming. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Michelle. Good job.